Guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Drew. It's great to have you here. In today's functional anatomy video, we are looking at the intercostal muscle group, and there are essentially two. There's the external intercostals and the internal intercostals, and they pretty much have two jobs or two roles. The first role is in respiration or breathing, and the second role is in just providing support and structure to the rib cage itself. So we were going to look at the external intercostals first, which is the inspiration muscle, and then we'll look at the internal intercostals, which are the expiration muscle. So as always, we are using Complete Anatomy. You can find a link to the app in the description below. We're only looking at some of the different tools that you can use. So I highly recommend that you jump on there and support the company and buy the app, particularly if you're interested in anatomy. So let's get stuck straight into it, shall we? So what we do, if you're new to the app, you simply just click on the structure you want to look at. So in this case, it's going to be the external intercostals. On the left here, it'll pull down the info tab for you. This gives you a really good overview of what's going on here. So info, quick facts, origin, inferior borders of the first to 11th ribs. So origin means that we're starting at the inferior border. So if this is rib 1 here, the inferior border is basically the bottom. Okay. So we've got rib 1, rib 2, rib 3, rib 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So 12 ribs, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 12 external intercostal muscles on the rib cage, which means there's 24 of them. Okay. Then we go down to the insertion, superior border of the ribs immediately below the origin site. So if you look here, so the origin is going to be the superior border, and then it goes down to the next rib below. So essentially it's going from one rib above to the rib below. Now, just taking notice here of the fiber direction, they're almost fairly vertical or a slight oblique angle. And even when you're coming around behind, they still are running down fairly vertical, which means that when the whole muscle contracts, that thin strip of intercostals, when it contracts, it's going to move the rib, okay, which is what they're going to do. So the kind of the job or the role of the intercostals is going to create more interthoracic space, because when you breathe in, the lungs are going to inflate like balloons. So we want to create more space to get more air into the lungs. And so what happens is that the external intercostals are going to pull the bottom rib up. So the one below is going to pull up. So the first rib is not really going to move much. It's fairly stable. And then it's going to pull the second rib up, and then the third rib is going to be pulled up, the fourth rib is going to be pulled up, the fifth, etc. So what that does is it basically elevates each rib and creates more space between each rib. All right. And so what happens is you get this spreading of the ribs. At the same time, now if it was just the intercostals doing that, what happens is as this one lifts up here, it's not really going to move very far, because the rib will just kind of pull up, but the space there will pretty much stay the same. And you see this in a lot of dysfunctional breathing patterns where people have, they're stuck in extension. So they're kind of, they're in a back bend all the time, if you will. And that means that the ribs can't move very well. And so you're breathing, but you're not getting much of this rib cage movement. And so you can't create the space to get more air in. So the volume of air you can get into your lungs is decreased. What we often find is people breathing more into their neck and shoulders using their scalenes to lift up through here to try to create more space. But you can't really get much more space in this smaller area through here. What we need to kind of factor in is the diaphragm. So on the inspiration, the diaphragm is going to be pulling downward. Remember, the diaphragm is attaching onto the internal ribs here as well. So you get this kind of upward pull of the ribs. At the same time, you get this downward pull of the ribs. at the same time as you breathe in. And so that creates more space for the ribs to actually expand and spread apart. And that's the real key. So when you're inhaling, you need to use the diaphragm and the intercostals together to create that space. Often when we're teaching yoga, one of the kind of cues that I love in yoga is to try to find more room or more space in the inhale, in the breath. And what they're talking about, depending on the position you are in your asana or your stretching positions, okay, the ribs are going to be put in different kind of alignment, different positions. And if you're in some kind of rotation or twist, one side of the ribs will be like in a closed position, essentially where the joints have basically rotated to the point where they can't go any further, but that then opens up the other side. And so you breathe into the other side, for example. So if I side bend to the left, my left here, my left rib cage is through here are going to be close. I just reached on the screen to show you, like you can see what I'm pointing at. If I side bend to the left, they bring these left ribs down here. This is actually going to open up the space here. So when you inhale, these intercostals are going to have more space to actually pull the ribs up, pull them up, so you can create that space. But at the same time, the diaphragm's pulling down through here. And that way you get this kind of full expansion of the ribs that spread out. Now, these muscles can absolutely be trained, the intercostal muscles, the respiratory muscles, you can absolutely train them. All right. If you just exercising properly, walking, running, jogging, lifting weights, you're using these muscles, you won't have to think about them. But if you're doing specific mobility, kind of stretching, strength training, yoga, Pilates, that kind of stuff, different martial art practices, Qigong, where you're kind of creating rotation, different shapes, you can breathe into those areas and you can essentially train the entire rib cage to work in different sections just by just putting yourself in different positions. So in a really good yoga series, for example, a good yoga asana series will take you through all the different positions of the spine. And so after a while, you get a really robust respiratory system or biomechanics in the respiratory system. And that's the precursor before we go into pranayama, which is their breath work, specific practices. So if you jump into breath work too quickly, particularly the more kind of superventilation, Bastrika, bellows breath, tumor breathing type practices, you can kind of get yourself a bit of trouble because you're not using the mechanics correctly. So breath work is really about understanding the biomechanics of how breathing works. So the other thing that happens here is that as you inhale, you go into extension. So your spinal muscles here, the erector spinae, which is threading down the back here, are going to be basically straightening your back up and creating an extension of the spine or a back bend. So when you extend the spine, as these muscles are pulling down this way, okay, and you're breathing in, the sternum's going to lift up that way. The external intercostals are pulling the ribs down. The diaphragm is pulling the ribs downward as well. And that downward movement with the downward movement of the external intercostals in conjunction with the spinal extension changes the entire orientation of the rib cage. Okay, and it allows it all to expand and open. Okay, so then on the exhalation, this is where the internal intercostals come into it. So they're on the other side. So these are the internal intercostals. And it's essentially a mirror of the external intercostals. The 5 directions are going a similar way, very vertical or a slight oblique angle. But this time what they're going to do, instead of pulling the rib down, they're going to depress the rib back up. So they're going to pull the rib back up, back up, back up, back up that way. And that way, the rib space is closed down, okay, and that decreases the intrathoracic volume, which then pushes the air out of the lungs. So it's just a reversal of the external intercostals. The internal intercostals are your expiration muscle. The external intercostals are your inspiration muscle. It gets a bit confusing because you've got external and inspiration, and then internal intercostals or expiration. It gets a little bit, just think of it backwards. Now, at the same time as the internal intercostals are pulling the ribs back up, kind of like in that kind of concertina fashion, the rectus abdominis, which attaches onto the sternum, onto the ribs, the internal and external obliques, which attach onto the ribs as well. They're contracting and they're pulling the rib cage down, which then helps dome the diaphragm back up. So you get this exhalation of the diaphragm being pushed up. So we have the two muscles, external intercostals, which is your inspiration muscle, so they spread the ribs apart. And then you have the internal intercostals, which are your expiration muscles, which bring the ribs back together. Okay, and they work with the diaphragm and the core muscles, particularly, and the back extension muscles. So you can kind of see why one of my sayings I have is breathing is core training and core training is breathing, because the core muscles, the abdominal wall, and the back extensors, they're all intricately linked into creating more space in the thorax to get more air in and out of the lungs. Why is that important? Because if you can get more air into the lungs, then you can kind of extract more oxygen off the out of the air and then into the bloodstream, and then more blood transporting oxygen around the body equals more oxygen delivery to the tissues and the cells, which means more potential to create ATP or energy as it goes into the biomechanics of biochemical process of creating energy in the body, which in Chinese medicine we call qi. And so you can do more work. So the body is capable of doing more work because it's got more energy production, assuming that you've got a good fuel source, as in nutrients, and that you're well grounded and you've got a good steady voltage or electrical potential in the body. So to make energy in the cell, you need electrical charge or voltage, you need oxygen, you need a fuel, which is either going to be glucose, so a carbohydrate source, a lipid source, so fats. You can do a protein, but it's not very efficient. So you need basically good, healthy diet, and you need to be electrically grounded as well. And that way, then you can kind of create qi in the body. And that's the basis of Chinese medicine, essentially. And a lot of kind of movement therapies, like the energetic based therapies. So that's a quick overview or rundown of the biomechanics of the internal and external intercostals. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, in complete anatomy, they don't have a movement diagram like they have of nearly all the other models. So you can't really get a sense of the movement that happens there. But if you refer back to the diaphragm video I did, you can see how the ribs expand and close as the diaphragm's pulling down and then relaxing up, pulling down, contracting, and then relaxing back up. So refer back to the diaphragm video to kind of complete this kind of picture of breathing muscles. And so the intercostals and the diaphragm comprise the two primary respiratory muscles. Then there's the accessory muscles, or muscles that are really going to help create space on the rib cage. So for example, if we put in, let's put in the scalenes. So we have this scalene muscle here. And so because this scalene attaches onto the first rib, when it contracts, it's either going to be pulling down onto the cervical vertebrae. So that's going to create lateral flexion. And because it's slightly front of the pivot point, a bit of rotation. But if the head's kind of like in a position, if these muscles contract, it's going to create an elevation. It's going to pull that first rib up. So it's going to lift your first rib up like that. So that creates a bit more space in this upper lobe to get our oxygen into the upper lobe of the lungs. We want to get oxygen into all 5 lobes. The lower lobes of the lungs are a lot bigger, so you can get more air in, which means you can extract more oxygen through this thing called Boyle's law, which we'll cover at some point. So that would be considered a secondary respiratory muscle. And when you get people with dysfunctional breathing pattern, hyperventilation syndrome, panic attacks, chronic shortness of breath, COPD, these kind of things, you'll often see really well overdeveloped scalene muscles. And one of the issues with that is that you have all the nerves that are coming out of the side of the neck, which kind of come thread down here. The brachial plexus goes under the collarbone and down to the arm. So a super tight scalenes can compress or impinge or obstruct that kind of nerve supply. And that can kind of create all kinds of issues for folks as the nerves coming out there. So breathing, if you're doing it incorrectly, you can create a lot of neck and shoulder problems because you're overusing these scalene muscles here as well. So another accessory muscle that you might consider would be, let's say, upper trapezius. Upper lip. We don't want upper lip. We want upper trap tissue. Where is it? Let's just try typing it all. Get me out of the way. Where are you? Why is it not popping up? There we go. That was a long way around to getting there, but we got there. Okay, so we've got the trapezius muscle. Now this is where the traps can be a secondary breathing muscle, probably in a tertiary, because they don't actually attach onto any ribs per se. So there's no muscular attachment onto the ribs. But what it does do is that it lifts up the collarbone and then by extension the scapula. So the whole shoulder girdle lifts up, and that lifting up also then tends to recruit those scalene muscles as well. So they kind of come together. And so you can get that really, really tight upper trapezius because people are up here in their necks. And you can often see it because it's really tight and well developed. It's not as loose and soft. So upper traps and scalenes, you'll often see that in a dysfunctional breathing pattern type scenario. Cool. All right. So let's leave it there. If you have any questions regarding your intercostals, so remember the external intercostals are your inspiration muscle. They depress, they pull the ribs down to create more space. The internal intercostals are your expiration muscle. They bring the ribs back together to decrease the space in the lungs to push air out. Okay. All right. And they can absolutely be trained by just breathing with your rib or your torsos in different positions, and you're breathing into the space where there's more space. So if you side bend to my left, for example, and I breathe into my right ribs, that's going to facilitate more rib movement, so more external intercostals as they pull each rib down. On the side bending too, the ribs are already closed down, so they've got them all ready to go. So you can't really contract those muscles. But then you just shift the other side and do it the other side. So a really good way of training respiratory muscles is to practice planks. So straight plank, side plank, side plank. So you kind of start to get really good kind of static respiratory mechanics going on there. Some kind of twisting movement, something like a leg rotation is really helpful as well. But you always try to integrate with the breathing techniques. So when I teach my Pilates class, I'm just forever saying inhale and exhale and with the technique of each movement to help the students understand when they should be breathing in, when they should be breathing out, because when they get that correct, the body kind of really sinks in together and things just start working correctly, which is amazing. So if you have any questions, drop them down in the comments. Please leave me a like, share the video with all your anatomy nerd friends. We'll see you on the next one. I'm not sure what I'm doing next. If you have any particular muscle groups I haven't covered that you'd like me to see, let me know. Otherwise, wherever you are, keep studying, keep learning, stay humble, and we'll see you for the next video. Cheers, everyone.